Hello and welcome back to Historical Terminology, and today we're going to talk about socialism, which is an idea that's pretty prevalent in, I think, the current discourse in the United States, but also just throughout history has become a very important factor that has led to some misconceptions about what exactly it is. So we're going to cover that today in historical terminology. So what exactly is socialism? Socialism is kind of a collection of different ideas, but mainly it's a political, social, and economic philosophy that encompasses all sorts of different ideas and systems. Um, Socialism's main goal is to eliminate the inefficiencies in capitalist systems and to eliminate the profit system. So you can kind of summarize all that as it's just kind of meant to empower the average worker and redistribute wealth fairly, because they feel that capitalism doesn't do so fairly enough. So what are the basic things that socialists are trying to do? The main goal of socialism, right, is to oppose capitalism, because they think capitalism is inherently bad and what's the word I'm looking for? Takes advantage of the people who work. Meanwhile, the other goal, right, is kind of just to advocate for a post-capitalist system, right? So they want to oppose capitalism, but obviously, right, they can't. They believe, right, that's not always just going to change overnight. So they're going to advocate for a post-capitalist system based on social ownership of the means of production. So they're going to advocate for changes in the current government structure to try to get closer to what they believe is their end goal. So how did all this start? Well, socialism kind of came about in the late 1800s, and they really first started kind of internationally being acclaimed when the internationals began in the 1890s, and they were basically these large group meetings of socialists from all over the world. And by all over the world, I usually just mean European nations. And so as time went on, the internationals kind of became larger and larger with delegates from all these different countries. And the goals of these meetings were to unite all socialists under one banner. Now, there were many different groups in the early years, and they all had these kind of wide-ranging views and goals, right? Every time some sort of new idea comes in, there's always going to be different people who interpret those ideas. And so the internationals were kind of this way of they're trying to unite everybody under one common goal instead of being divided in that way. Now, the biggest early division in socialist thought was between Marxists and reformists. Marxists advocated that there needs to be some sort of revolution to create the changes that socialism sought. That may be a violent revolution, that may be a peaceful revolution, but they know that they believe there needs to be a revolution to make these changes. And Marxists often kind of tended or leaned towards an authoritative control to make changes. So they didn't believe in a democratic systems. They wanted to take control and change things from the top. Meanwhile, reformists, which were mostly people in like England and sometimes in France, right? These were people who kind of advocated for change within the existing systems to achieve the goals of socialism. So they wanted to use the democratic process to make changes, and they didn't really believe that this revolution was necessary. They thought that they could achieve their goals by reforming the systems that were already there. So now, by the 1900s, then socialism kind of had achieved enough of an influence to start doing things. For instance, in 1917, during the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, which were Marxists, take control of the Russian Soviets, and Russia becomes the Soviet Union. And communism really branches off as a separate thing from socialism, and we'll talk about that difference in a second. Now, on the other hand, right, those reformists really become the labor movement and the socialist movement, and those are the non-Bolshevik socialists, and they're creating their own groups, their own internationals, trying to maintain kind of a collective identity. And their main difference, right, of course, is the rejection of this authoritarian approach that the Marxists have been taking. So now, in practice, after World War II, after all these kind of things have happened, socialist policies end up gaining traction in a lot of European nations. Social democratic parties institute social reforms and wealth redistribution via welfare and taxation, and this is in most of Western Europe. And other policies include state control of certain industries. So they're trying to implement these practices because they were able to come to power in a lot of different countries. And so they were able to institute the reforms they had so much wanted to do. Now let's backtrack a second and talk about why communism and socialism are different at this point. So remember, they were all kind of coming from the same general strain in the beginning, but after the events of the Russian Revolution and sort of things like that, the communists, or this kind of more authoritarian group, became something different. So let's talk about why that happened. First of all, right, socialism has kind of shifted to become this gradual reform process that occurs through democratic processes. Right, that's how socialists have been getting their job done. They've been working with the institutions that are there to improve the lives of workers and, as they would say, like the proletariat. Right, most left-leaning parties in Europe are at least in some way socialist, and they use taxation and state-run industry and social reform to meet the goal of socialism. Right, to create a post-capitalist society where it's more economically fair for everyone. Communism, however, right, starting in 1917, becomes this entirely different beast. And really, communism is kind of like this state-run capitalism that requires authoritarian control to work. So it's actually not really the same thing. They're very different, and they have very different means of meeting their goals, which are similar. So on this next page here, I've got kind of a I don't know, like a table that explains the differences between modern socialism and communism. As you can see in the democratic socialism column, we've got things like parliamentary democracy, individual liberties, a mix of both public and private sector things. Most prices are determined by the free market, but there's also redistribution of income through taxes, equality of opportunities, the main goal, right? They're working on these kind of nice mixtures of the financial system that ends up with everybody better off. Whereas in communism, it requires revolution. There's an authoritarian state. State controls everything, right? There's an equality of outcome, but there's not an equality of opportunity. And so that's the main difference between socialism and communism. I think that's where a lot of people get mixed up. They see these two things as the same, where in reality there's a big difference between the two. Now, just to kind of give you some evidence as to how these things have been working out, we've got some graphs here. The first one on the left says that socialist countries are some of the most productive societies, and that is true. If you see on the left here, it's GDP per hour worked, and these are all the different democratic socialism scores. And as you can see, democratic socialist countries are way on the right, which is a good thing, right? They're getting a lot of production out of their workers, and they're using these socialist policies. On the right, same thing here. This is about the equality of society. So on the left, you got economic equality score, and on the bottom, you've got the democratic socialism score. And you can see that as you trend upward, you're seeing a lot of those Western European countries with their social democratic thing, right? They have economic equality, and they're also being productive. So those are some evidence that these policies do work. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Terminology, and please subscribe. The more people who subscribe, the more people I know want to watch certain things, and then I can make more videos. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next time for some more historical terminology.